Today's video is going to look a little different than my other ones because I'm filming and uploading it in 60 frames per second. I'm doing this so that I can provide samples demonstrating the pros and cons of mixed frame rate video projects, which is today's topic. Let's get undone. What is happening, everybody? I'm Gerald Undone, and today we're talking about frame rates. Now, this video isn't going to be about which frame rate is better or if we should still be using 24p. In fact, Filmmaker IQ already covered that topic brilliantly on their channel, so I recommend you check that video out. Instead, we're going to be tackling a topic that is asked over and over again in forums and comments. What happens when I put X frame rate footage into Y frame rate timeline? The format for this video is going to be really simple. I've got about a dozen video clips showing various frame rate combinations. They're all of the same panning shot executed at the same speed, and we're going to be breaking down the pros and cons of each and debunking some of the more common myths about them. So let's get started with the first example, which is how this video is recorded 60p footage into a 60p timeline. As you can see, this clip plays back rather nicely, and I chose this one to start because it'll be our control. And when I say plays back nicely, I mean that the image doesn't stutter when moving across the screen. This judder is caused by a few factors, including the refresh rate of the screen you're viewing this video on, as well as the actual speed of the pan. For each of these examples, one of the factors we're going to be discussing is the panning speed. Now, I conducted the pan at the same speed for all of these examples, which I based on the slowest frame rate that we're going to use, which is 24p. The slower the frame rate you shoot in, the slower you need to pan or move the camera in order to prevent that stuttery look. There's an old rule that suggests that you should pan no faster than a screen width every 7 seconds. Now that's a decent start, but it doesn't account for the other factors that we just mentioned. But there's a good resource from Red, if you didn't know already, that calculates your ideal panning speed. I'll put a link to this calculator in the description, but it looks like this. So first, you choose your sensor size. Now this directly relates to the focal length for determining your angle of view, which is obviously important because your total angle of view will determine how many objects are in the frame and how far they're moving when you conduct your pan. Now I'm going to put in 32 millimeters for my focal length because I shot these clips on a 16 millimeter micro four thirds lens, which is about the equivalent angle of view of a 32 millimeter full frame lens, and the Red Monstro is a full frame sensor. And then you put in your frame rate, which, like I said, I base it on the slowest frame rate I'm going to use, which is 24p. That's how I timed all the shots. And then you do your panning angle. Now the panning angle is how far you're going to move across the frame. So if you went pole to pole like this, that's going to be 180 degrees, and then half of that would be 90, and so on. So for an arc about like this, that's about a 45 degree pan. So when we put that into the panning angle, it will generate our panning duration over here, which is 8.9 seconds. That's how long you need to spend to get across. If you count it in your head, you'd want to count to at least 9 going from the start of the pan to the completion of the pan if you're going to cover 45 degrees with all these settings. And that's exactly what I did when I conducted these tests. Now, if you increase the frame rate, the time required goes down because there's going to be more frames to work with, so you can do it faster and the footage will still be less jerky because it'll have more frames to fill those in. So if we bump it up to 60 frames per second, it'll have a suggested panning duration of 3.6 seconds. This makes sense because 3.6 is 40% of 8.9 seconds and 24p is 40% of 60p. Being able to pan faster can be advantageous if you need to tightly control the duration of your project or if you need to follow fast action, but things get a little bit different when we drop that footage into a slower timeline. So let's jump back to the 60p footage on the 60p timeline combination in order to refresh your memory, but I'll also be putting timestamps to all these samples in the description below, so after the video if you want to jump around and rewatch some of them, you'll be able to do that. So this sample is smooth, and we could even bump up the pan speed to the fastest of the three of them if we wanted, and it would still be smooth. The shot looks nice. Overall, this is a good result. Now, if we drop that same 60p clip into a 30p timeline without slowing it down, it looks like this. Still pretty decent, but it's slightly worse because any shakes or jumps have the potential to be worsened by frame dropping. When you put 60p footage into a 30p timeline, it just throws away half of the frames in order to make it fit. And this mostly looks good, but if you do happen to have any unwanted movement followed by a drop frame, it can make the unwanted movement more obvious and give it a more jarring effect. But on a perfect pan, it'll be hard to tell the difference between the two. But another consideration to make is that if you shoot a pan at 60p, but you intend to just drop frame it into a 30p timeline, you have to pan at the speed required for 30p, not 60p. So if we jump back into the Red panning speed calculator and we change the frame rate to 30 frames per second and hit calculate, we're going to need 7.1 seconds in order to conduct that pan, even though we're shooting at 60p, because we're going to be throwing out half of those frames. Despite that though, I would still say that 60p into a 30p timeline produces a good result. Now something we can do to prevent those more stringent requirements is to slow the footage down to half speed. This will use all 60 frames rather than dropping some of them, but it'll take twice as long to play back. And this increased duration is the only con because it pretty much improves the footage in every other way if you're okay with the aesthetic. Those shakes and bumps I was talking about will actually be reduced because it'll be in slow motion, so they'll be less noticeable, and the pan speed will go back to the normal 60p pan speed of 3.6 seconds because once it's slowed down, the video clip will be 7.2 seconds, so you'll be hitting the pan speed required for 30p. So you'll end up with similar smoothness to 60p footage on a 60p timeline, but with reduced camera shake impact, but you'll have a dreamier slow motion effect. But overall, I would say that this is a good result. Now, if we put that same 60p clip into a 24p timeline, we'll really start to experience that judder I've been talking about. And not only that, but you also need to use the steadiest and slowest pan speed of the three. Now, the reason why the stuttering is increased is because it doesn't divide evenly into the timeline. When 60p went into 30p, you just dropped every other frame. But to go into 24p, you have to drop every 2.5 frames. And then to play it back on your standard 60 Hz display, that footage has to then be reorganized back into a base 30 configuration. And this process is known as a 2-to-3 or 3-to-2 pull down. But regardless of that, generally, putting 60p into a 24p timeline at 100% speed does not produce a very good result. Now we can minimize some of the issue of displaying 24p content on a 60 Hz display by panning at the correct speed and by using ideal frame rate combinations, but we can't remove it completely. The only way to remove the display-based judder is to actually show this on a projector capable of flashing 24 frames per second, or by showing it on a display that's capable of reversing the pull down smoothly internally. Some higher frame rate displays like 120 Hz models do have some mechanisms for dealing with 24p because it does divide evenly from 120. However, when it comes to movies, these modern displays using these techniques often will kind of remove the aesthetic that the filmmakers had in mind because that can only be achieved when actually viewing it at 24 frames per second. So in essence, we can do our best, but when it comes to watching this on, say, YouTube, you can never really get 24p content to look quite as good as it will on a 24p projector. So for the majority of users with typical 60 Hz displays, you'll need to combat that judder by avoiding the bad frame rate combinations that we're about to cover. But one of the ways that you can improve the 60p on 24p combination is by slowing it down, just like we did with the 30p timeline. Now I want to touch on something real quick that I've read on a few forums when it comes to interpreting footage. Depending on the NLE you use to edit video, this may differ for you, but when it comes to Premiere Pro, there's basically two ways to slow down a 60p clip into a 24p timeline, or any timeline combination for that matter. You can right-click on the 60p clip and then choose Modify and then Interpret, and in here you type in your timeline frame rate, so in this case, 23.976 for 24p, and then you just drop it in the timeline. However, you can also just drop it in your timeline without interpreting the footage and then change it afterwards using speed and duration. If we right-click on the imported clip and then go to speed and duration and then change the speed to 40%, it'll produce the same result as interpreting it as 24p, because 24p is 40% of 60p. I've seen some debate in the forums about this, but I'm here to settle the dispute and say they are the same thing. They produce the same result. But I actually prefer the speed and duration method because it allows me to fine-tune it by percentage, and it allows me to do speed ramps and other fun tricks. Anyway, so if we slow the clip down to 40%, this will remove the majority of the stuttering that we saw when it was at 100% speed. It also once again reduces the impact of any camera shake because we're in slow motion, and you can also go back to the panning speed of 60p instead of the slower 24p one. Only do this, of course, if you know that you're going to be slowing it down for 24p timeline. And slowing it down like this will take it from a bad result into a good result. The other speed option you can choose is 80%. 80% will give you a usable frame rate of 48 frames per second. 60 times 0.8 is 48. And this is evenly divisible by 24, much in the same way that 60p goes into 30p. You just drop every other frame. This means you'll have a pretty smooth shot and you'll be able to pan a little bit faster as well. This will create a bit of a different look than the 40% speed. 40% is more like real slow motion, where 80% is just kind of dreamy. Not completely slowed down, but just a little bit calm and relaxing like that, kind of like a music video. And you will have a little bit of reduced noticeability on camera shake. Overall, I'd say this is another good result. Now the 80% trick can also be used for 30p footage on a 24p timeline, because 80% of 30 is 24, and it's the only way that I would ever insert 30p footage into a 24p timeline. Because if you leave it on 100%, it looks like this. There's terrible judder, and you still need to pan at the 24p speed, and the camera shake is worsened by drop frames. This is the worst combination of higher frame rates Terrible result. If you slow it down to 80% though, you can pan at a faster speed, you can pan at the 30p rate, and again, it does reduce some of the noticeability of camera shake, but you do have that dreamy music video-like look that we were just talking about, but overall, I would say that this is a good result. Lastly, when it comes to 30p, you can obviously insert it into a 30p timeline, which is a good result. It's just not quite as smooth as 60p into a 60p timeline because there are fewer frames, so you're going to have to pan at the regular 30p rate, but it does produce a clean result, which works really well on standard 60Hz displays. The same is mostly true for 24p footage in a 24p timeline. This is the standard of the movie business and creates that film-like quality that people gush about. This is how I shoot the majority of my videos, mostly because I prefer the aesthetic and also because it's more efficient for storage and exposure. In fact, you might have noticed that the image to this video is noisier than my regular videos are because I had to compensate exposure-wise for the increased frame rate and thus shutter speed. So that's definitely an advantage to using a slower frame rate like 24 frames per second. However, 24p does suffer from two of the cons that we've been mentioning. One, it doesn't look as smooth on a standard 60Hz display because of that repeating frames and 3:2 pull down thing we were talking about. And two, it requires the slowest and steadiest pans to look good. And that's why in a lot of movies, the establishing shots will be slow crawls into the frame instead of pans. Basically, 24p produces a great result if done correctly, but not so great if done hastily. Now, we're not going to be covering 120 frames per second in depth because basically everything I said before can be applied to inserting 120p into slower timelines. The only difference is that the speed adjustments are going to need to change. You can obviously pan the fastest of the lot at 120p, and when it comes to slowing it down, you would use 50% speed for a 60p timeline, 25% for a 30p timeline, and 20% for a 24p timeline. And another advantage for 120p is that it's divisible evenly by all three of those numbers. Now, for the sake of being thorough, let's cover the reverse. What if you insert 24p footage into a 30p or 60p timeline? Well, the result is bad because the required frames just aren't there. It doesn't matter how slow or fast you pan, it will always jump and stutter. The only way you can get away with it is if there's very little motion in your scene, but for almost every other purpose, you're going to want to avoid doing this. So that's pretty much it when it comes to the functionality of these combinations. But just because a combination produces an acceptable result technically, doesn't mean that you're going to want to use that in all or any of your projects. Just because 60p and a 24p timeline at 80% speed works, doesn't mean it's going to produce the look that you're going for. And that's the part that you're going to have to decide on yourself. And that's always been one of the biggest trade-offs. Take viewing content on the web, for instance. 30p will definitely produce a smoother result when it comes to playing back on standard devices, but 24p has that aesthetic that's mostly lost at higher frame rates. So my advice is to have a plan. Use this video as a guide to know the limitations of the different frame rate combinations, but then plan out your shots accordingly. You don't want to get stuck with mismatched footage that you're going to have to apply unwanted speed adjustments to just to fit it in. Like they say in carpentry, measure twice, cut once. But that's going to be it for me. I hope you found this video helpful or at least entertaining. And if you did, make sure you leave it the old thumbs up and consider subscribing if you haven't already. But if you did not find this video helpful or entertaining, feel free to hit the dislike button twice. All right, I'm done.